Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us at the Center for New American Security for this special Safe at Home conversation. We have a very packed hour for you of really wonderful guests who are experts on the topic that we're going to be talking about. We have just released a new report at the Center for New American Security entitled Protecting the Protectors, Countering Domestic Violent Extremism in the military, veteran, and law enforcement communities. And later in the program, we have an incredible set of experts lined up to discuss that specific report's findings and recommendations. But first, before we get to that expert panel, I am thrilled to welcome Josh Geltzer, who is Assistant to the President and Deputy Homeland Security Advisor. Among his many accomplishments, Josh was the founding executive director of Georgetown Law's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, and he previously served on the National Security Council staff as senior director for counterterrorism and deputy legal advisor. I could go on and on about Josh's many accomplishments, but our time is short with him. And the most important thing that you need to know today is that Josh has been a leader on developing the Biden administration's Homeland Security policies, including the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. And so we are so grateful that he is here with us this morning to share his insights. And we are especially fortunate to have him in public service. So Josh, welcome to CNAS.
Carrie, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thanks for the chance to be part of this really great event. I've been looking forward to it.
Wonderful. So let's get started. I want to start with you, Josh, with really the big picture. It was in June of 2021 that the Biden administration released what is, my understanding, the first ever national strategy for domestic terrorism. And so now that we are, a year and a half later, I'd really like to get your sense for how you see that strategy having set the government, the federal government, on track. How are you measuring the strategy's impact?
It's such an important question because strategies are good, but implementation of those strategies and adjustments in that implementation are even better. And that is what we've tried to do in that almost year and a half since we released the strategy. I'll just hit a few examples of where we've looked back and think that implementation is strong and needs to get even stronger because the threat remains persistent. Start with the first piece of the strategy, which is about generating and sharing more swiftly, more widely, understandings of the domestic terrorism threat, quite a complicated threat landscape. We have looked back since the strategy was issued, and we find that in particular, FBI and DHS, which are at the heart of generating this type of analysis, have issued more work on domestic terrorism-related threats. They have become more sophisticated in how they analyze it, and they've received better feedback on it from especially state and local partners who are critical. They're often on the front lines of being able to identify and hopefully disrupt a particular act of violence. We've also found new mechanisms for delivering that sort of threat analysis. NCTC has released a smartphone-based app. DHS has as well. So that's it's one cluster of examples of how a piece of the strategy we've tried to improve, and yet we want to keep pushing ourselves. I'll take one other piece, which is the way in which we've tried to tackle the online radicalization dimension of this, which looms quite large for all of us who work on it. We have, as an administration, entered the multi-stakeholder arrangement of the Christchurch Call to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. We've been an active participant with fellow governments, with civil society, with tech companies, with experts and researchers in trying to drill down on what online radicalization looks like today and how there can be better collaboration to address it. I could go on, Carrie. I'll just say we're also conscious of the fact that the work isn't done. There are still horrific attacks that occur less often than they would, but for the great work of folks across the government. And the work doesn't end, but there's a reason one creates a national strategy. It's because there's a really hard, persistent problem. That's why we've built something multifaceted and sustainable to get at it. And that's where implementation now has us doing the work.
That's great. So that's really helpful in terms of setting the stage. What's interesting to me is that in terms of the federal government entities that are involved, so you mentioned DHS, you mentioned FBI, and NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center. Those are the organizations that have been set up to handle terrorism writ large, whether it's international and domestic. From your bird's eye position at the White House and working with the National Security Council, and looking sort of big picture in terms of Homeland security strategy across the enterprises, are you seeing, or do you find that the strategy has directed changes within any of those organizations, whether it's FBI, DHS, or NCTC, or is the increased attention on domestic terrorism just sort of like changes on the margins?
I think there's been real change, and I think it's to the credit of folks like Bishop Garrison, whom everyone will get a chance to hear from later in this event, for taking a national strategy, a whole of executive branch strategy, and then making it real within particular departments in a way that makes sense. So I won't steal Bishop's thunder, but he was the driving force behind the Defense Department's own implementation of the strategy, including in ways that make sense specifically for service members and some of the unique ways in which bad actors try to recruit and radicalize them. Similarly, in a place that you and I have each worked, Carrie, the National Security Division of the Justice Department, I give great credit to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Matt Olson, for innovating, for taking within the counterterrorism section that's part of his division, the initiative of building a domestic terrorism specific unit that can have the sort of expertise, have the sort of familiarity with what's available in this space to really work on cases in a sophisticated way, no matter where they arise around the country. That builds on earlier innovation by this Justice Department in issuing a memo in the first months of this administration telling U.S. attorneys' offices, FBI field offices across the country, if you are looking at matters that seem to meet the federal statutory definition of domestic terrorism, bring them to Main Justice the way you would international terrorism matters, so that we can help, so that we can have the expertise, the experience to figure out what charges might be available or how this can be handled most effectively. So I think you pair up that memo with this new domestic terrorism specific unit. That's not just changes at the margins, that's real innovation. And I think it's having an impact in the way these cases are handled by federal law enforcement really across the country, and in the type of partner federal law enforcement can be to state, local, territorial, and tribal law enforcement as well.
Right. So let's drill down a little bit on the partnership aspect, because unlike international terrorism, which is so heavily reliant on intelligence community work, liaison with foreign partners, and very federal government focused in terms of how those investigations often develop over the past 2 decades. Domestic terrorism demands, I would argue, even, and you can disagree with this if you disagree with it, but even greater collaboration, communication, information sharing throughout the whole country, including with state and local law enforcement, but also outside government. So can you shed more light on what is the universe of partnerships that are needed to be able to effectively address a growing domestic terrorism threat?
I think it's the perfect framing. You know, I do not like to disagree with you, and I do not plan to start now, because I do think that the threat environment is somewhat different from at least the paradigm case of international terrorism that many of us internalize post 9/11. So there, and this is a bit of a caricature, but it's being grounded in reality, the case for information sharing was some long-running plot that the federal government was tracking, maybe trying to put together the pieces of, and ensuring that got shared across the federal family, and then with relevant state and local partners, was a real push post 9/11. And it's still critical. But here, we overwhelmingly see in recent years that the domestic terrorism related threats are individuals or small groups who move to violence sometimes quite quickly. And that does not create the same sort of intelligence sharing in which you're tracking someone or really a group of people for months. Instead, it requires indicators and warnings and trends and a sense of what date, what gathering of significance to those who believe in certain ideologies and call for others to act violently based on them might loom particularly large for that community. That's a different form of information sharing, first of all. And it's part of what I think those products that I was talking about earlier have captured better and better from our law enforcement partners. But I also think, as you were saying, Carrie, there is a broader community that needs a good understanding of the threat environment as it evolves. So nonprofits are critical to that. I've spent time, the Secretary of Homeland Security has spent time, FBI has spent time briefing those who work with houses of worship, who work with NGOs. There is grant money available specifically for those types of entities. And this administration's most recent request to Congress boosted that particular grant funding from $250 million to about $350 million, already at its highest level in the previous fiscal year. And we're asking to take it about $100 million higher, all because we think those partners need our support. They need threat information, but they also need training. And that's some of where the grants can meet with information sharing, which is, what do you do if this sort of horrific circumstance unfolds? And the value of that became very concrete in not a domestic terrorism related incident, but an international terrorism related incident in Colleyville, in the synagogue in Texas, where a rabbi who received some of that training later was able to say that he put it to good use to get him and his congregation through a horrific incident in which none of them ended up being harmed or killed. So it does require a broader community that also includes the private sector, that also includes tech companies, where radicalization can occur, but where we want companies to understand our concerns and what worries us. And I think we've tried to structure the way in which we are sharing information on this and other threats so that there is that broader universe, as you put it, Carrie, of actors and players receiving the information and able to act on it.
So there actually was something that just has unfolded in the last week coming out of North Carolina, which, according to the news reports that I've seen, there has not yet been a motive or suspects identified. But I'm looking at some of the reports that have to do with the attack on a utility substation in North Carolina. I imagine you guys at the White House are tracking this particular event. And what was interesting to me in one of the reports that I was looking at is that there had been a FBI bulletin that came out last month that had to do with threats to electric infrastructure, according to the news report, by people espousing racially or ethnically motivated extremist ideology. And so I would imagine that's one of the potential things that law enforcement, again, this is something that's happening at the state level. This, for those who haven't been followed this closely, there was a shooting that occurred at electric substations over the weekend. Tens of thousands of individuals have been put out of having power in North Carolina. Schools have been closed. Businesses have had to close. And so there really is a serious impact to this community in North Carolina. And it's an ongoing investigation as to what the motive is, who did it. But so far, it appears, at least based on what the local sheriff is saying, to be a domestic incident, unknown yet whether or not it is just criminal in nature or just vandalism in nature, or whether there is some ideology or political motivation behind it, which then would put us into the realm of these things that we think about in terms of domestic extremism. So, Josh, I'm sure you can't comment on the particular investigation because that investigation is ongoing and still being worked on at the law enforcement level. But can you talk a little bit in terms of how we distinguish from a policy perspective between something that is a domestic, just criminal activity, act of vandalism, versus when we start to have a motive or think about it in terms of the ideologies that are currently growing out there.
It's such a poignant example, as you say, of the way in which we're trying to share information with partners in a couple senses. One is that, as you point out, staying away from the particularities of this investigation, which you rightly say are ongoing, there have been warnings about the types of targets that a range, or I should say individuals or small groups motivated by a range of ideologies and worldviews seem to be potentially attracted to. That's something that the FBI and DHS have worked very hard to warn state and local partners and the federal family about, because to say that this is a persistent and complex and dynamic threat environment is true, but state and locals need to allocate their resources somehow. That doesn't tell them where to put their cops or where to devote their attention. And so to try to say, here are dates of significance, gatherings of significance, targets we have seen those drawn to this violent ideology discuss as potentially suitable ones, it helps offer state and locals and territorial and tribal partners a better sense of how to allocate scarce and sometimes strained resources and personnel. And then when an incident does occur, it is, as you were saying at the end there, Carrie, it is often, it takes some work to figure out the ideology behind that. And that can be true even where the suspect, the attacker, is identified more swiftly than in this one, because the ideologies that make up domestic terrorism, domestic violent extremism right now, they are fluid, they evolve, different strains of them come together in different conspiracy theories, they morph, they take on a new notion, they hit different themes when those themes are salient in the news, whether those themes are lies about stolen elections or lies about immigrants and those arriving at this country, or whether they're lies about COVID and the response to it. But there's a fluidity as to that ideology that is different, at least, from some of what we've become accustomed to with respect to the likes of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, let's say. And that makes categorizing them hard. It can also make it hard even when there's been responsibility assigned to an individual or group of individuals for an attack that's taken place or an attack that's been disrupted. They don't fit neatly into buckets, and one may not look like one before it, because by then the ideology, the worldview has shifted and morphed.
And it's such an interesting point that you're making, Josh, because from what I've heard from talking to folks who are, current or former federal government officials working in this modern terrorism space, including domestic terrorism, is that there is such a range of ideologies that is potentially motivating individuals to violence. So it's not just far right, it's not just far left. Sometimes there can be an individual or small groups of individuals where when the motivations are uncovered, some of the motivations or the ideologies are sort of even mixed or inherently inconsistent within an individual's mind. And so can you just talk a little bit about sort of the challenge that when you're trying to set policy, how do you set policy in a space where it's not just looking at, a particular group with a well-defined ideology and political objective?
I think you've characterized it quite well, Carrie, and it is challenging. I mean, we designed the domestic terrorism strategy to be, in a sense, ideology agnostic within the category that is domestic terrorism, because, as you say, there can be far right, there can be far left, and there can be off the political spectrum. I wouldn't know how to characterize the ideology that's called the incel or involuntary celibate ideology that has had some lethal consequences in North America. That's not left, that's not right, that's its own brand of extremism, and extremism that has led some people to violence. And as you say, in addition to being potentially unrecognizable on a political spectrum, there are also individuals who seem to pull at different strands that a lot of people would find inconsistent and in severe tension with another. And yet, especially online, where a lot of individuals of this mindset spend a lot of time and engage and kind of soak up the most extremist views being disseminated, those kind of mix and mingle. And I even take one step back, which is to say that the Department of Homeland Security in particular has used the term terrorism and targeted violence for a number of years now. And I think what it's trying to capture is something that's almost adjacent to domestic terrorism. It wouldn't have potentially the ideological or political agenda that might make it fit firmly within that. And yet it's not random either. It's based on a kind of toxic stew of violence that we've seen from far too many violent actors in this country over the past year and a half alone. So there are concentric circles of related ideologies, there are overlapping circles, there are people who mix and match from within those, and then there are those who seem to be drawn to kind of almost a culture of violence. And that may not be domestic terrorism per se, but I wouldn't want us not to mention it in the course of this conversation, because of course to the victims it has the same horrific effects and consequences, and some of the same violence prevention efforts that we are investing in heavily as a government, we hope can help with those too.
So I want to direct, that's really helpful in terms of how, how we think about this current threat, because it is a different type of environment, I think. And so the institutions that are created to address the terrorism threat have had to adapt to this different type of motivations that are out there, the different information space, how people are becoming radicalized. I want to focus for a minute, though, even though we're primarily talking about domestic terrorism, there is an international connection to this in some ways. And there was a report that I just saw that came out of arrests that took place in Germany. A substantial law enforcement effort by the German government to arrest, looks like dozens of what are described in the news report. I'm looking at far-right extremists who were potentially plotting an overthrow of the German government. I know that sounds very inflammatory, but according to the reports that I'm reading, that is what it sounds like, that there was a group that potentially was plotting to overthrow the German government. That the reports I'm seeing, and these are preliminary, look like there were a number of arrests, that there potentially are connections between this group of German extremists with possibly other countries, including potential Russian involvement to some extent. And so my question to you, Josh, looking at from a policy perspective, working on Homeland Security matters, is have the silos, I guess, between the international picture and international terrorism, what some of us used to work on in terms of international terrorism, Al-Qaeda based, ISIS based, those types of groups. Is there something different about some of the domestic terrorism that we're looking today, where there is a line of intelligence inquiry, partnerships with foreign governments, at least exploring whether there is some international connection to it as well, even though we think there are groups that are US based?
We are not isolated in this world in many respects, and this is absolutely one of them. So I think you're quite right to point to news out of Germany, which we are monitoring closely here, obviously, as an example, and again, the full facts will come out, but of the way in which there is a transnational dimension to especially the racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist category, the category that you see in some of the intelligence assessments that have been released by our government, worries us the most at home and has the most international connectivity to it. And you've seen Director Wray testify before Congress that there are transnational connections, certainly online, where it's of course very easy to recruit and radicalize across national boundaries, but also with respect to travel, individuals who will travel for training or for other reasons, as well as some limited financial flows. And it's really that recruitment dimension, that idea of sharing in what violent actors themselves often see as a global community in which they point to each other's attacks. You have attackers in the US pointing to attackers in Norway and in New Zealand. You have attackers in Europe pointing to attackers in the US. They view themselves as part of a transnational community, an appalling transnational community, but a transnational community. And I think we are doing our best to be faithful to the ways in which that which is domestic has certain authorities and certain authority limitations, while also using the foreign-facing tools that are appropriate. You've seen one racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist entity, the Russian imperial movement, designated by the government as a specially designated global terrorist, SDGT, as well as 5 of its leaders designated as SDGTs. And you've seen, I think, an increasing acknowledgement of this transnational dimension as we talk about this threat category publicly. And I would especially point those who are interested in this to remarks and congressional testimony by the National Counterterrorism Center Director, Christy Abizaid, who's really been, I think, quite a thought leader in this and has helped set out publicly this transnational dimension.
And there's a flip side to that too, isn't there? Because we've had, I believe, Canada and New Zealand designate some U.S. Domestic groups as foreign terrorist organizations to them. So groups that are organic in the United States, domestic violent groups, then are designated by foreign partners. Can you speak a little bit to sort of how that then affects our international partners with our very close intelligence and law enforcement friends?
It's exactly right. I mean, it shows that they consider them of enough relevance. It matters enough to them that they devote the considerable energy and effort that it requires to designate an entity. Every country has its own designation regime, of course, but wherever you are, these things take work. They should take work so that you have to build a package and a record that supports that conclusion. And as the fact that there are countries like Canada that have done that with respect to some US-based entities shows that it matters to them. They do not regard them as wholly confined within US borders if they're taking the effort of doing so. And often when a country like that proceeds with such a designation or prescription, as some of them call them, they will brief us on their basis for it. They'll want us to be alerted so that we're not surprised by it. And it is helpful for us to know how they see those entities, what's led them to that conclusion. And depending on the country, it can increase their own domestic authorities for addressing those entities, should those entities either physically be moving into their territory by sending fighters or trainers, or whatever it might be, but also cutting off financial flows or seeking to recruit or radicalize there.
I'm going to hand things off shortly to my colleague, Kate Kuzminski. But before I do that, Josh, I want to ask you one final question. And I'm going to ask you to, in our last minute here together, I'm going to ask you to put on both of our old National Security Division, Justice Department hat. January 6, 2021, obviously was a historical marker for domestic terrorism that turned and domestic radicalization that turned violent in the attack on the Capitol. But notably, just a year and a half later, in the recent midterms, our elections were relatively peaceful and conducted effectively. We also have had a recent conviction of seditious conspiracy, which is a really serious charge that the Justice Department brought and successfully prosecuted. And I'm just curious whether your sense of things is that these prosecutions, the hundreds of arrests that have been made in connection with January 6th, in addition to the seditious conspiracy cases, whether that is having an impact in disrupting or toning down the current domestic threat landscape.
So I want to dwell for a moment on especially the first point you raised there, which is that this most recent round of elections, which in a sense wrapped up with yesterday's voting in Georgia, although of course there's still some work being done in particular races. But on the whole, to look back over these past few weeks, and given how much concern, understandable concern there was, given the lies that have been perpetrated about previous election cycles and how that has led some people to consider violence, it is to the credit of state and local election workers, security officials, volunteers, as well as those across the federal family who in many cases, very quietly, very discreetly, did the hard work of helping to prepare for this election cycle. I think the work of CISA and its director, Jen Easterly, the work of DHS more broadly, the work of DOJ and FBI, all of that contributed, but so did what I would like to see in those past few weeks, which is maybe a recommitment by an American people that disagrees about a lot, policy disagreements, even legal disagreements, but nonetheless, by the way in which they voted over the past few weeks, recommitted themselves to resolving our differences, at least peacefully. And those differences remain, but that's what happens in a democracy. Now, I'm not naive, and for the next cycle, there will be a lot of hard work that a lot of us do again to ensure that elections go as peacefully as possible. But I think it's worth dwelling on that moment as you have. And then it's obviously just tremendous work by federal law enforcement to undertake what you described, which is a historic set of investigations, arrests, prosecutions since January 6th. Obviously, we don't play a part in that from here at the White House, but that doesn't stop us from applauding the really strong work that federal law enforcement is doing. And I think that is just critical, not only in doing justice, which is ultimately what their work is about, but also in showing that this movement that some undertook to really attack a fundamental of our democracy, the idea that we resolve our differences peacefully and under the rule of law, that can be reestablished. And so it's to their credit that they've done so much so quickly.
Josh Geltzer, thank you so much. Special Assistant to the President, Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your insights and your time and all of your work on these issues. I want to hand things off now to my colleague, Kate Kuzminski, who is going to bring in our expert panel. Kate is Senior Fellow and Director of our Military, Veteran, and Society program here at the Center for New American Security. Kate?
All right, thanks so much, Carrie, and thanks to Josh for your really thoughtful comments. As Carrie mentioned, we have a really distinguished panel coming up talking through some of the findings and the larger conversation surrounding the report that we released yesterday that Carrie mentioned earlier, Protecting the Protectors. So we encourage you to check out that report. So we're joined today by three distinguished panelists. First, Seamus Hughes, who is the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University with a great background on the Hill. We're also joined by Rosa Brooks, the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Law and Policy at Georgetown University Law Center, and also a reserve officer, served as a reserve officer with the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police. And lastly, we're joined by Bishop Garrison, who served in the capacity as the Senior Advisor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to the Secretary of Defense, and also led the DoD working group looking at addressing violent extremism within the military. So thank you to all three of our panelists. I'm going to start with Seamus. So Seamus, one of the questions that was raised in our research and our conversations with law enforcement officers, with members on the Hill, and with leadership in the uniformed services is the question of whether or not domestic violent extremism is even a problem in the military. From a quantitative perspective, the numbers are fairly low, and there are reasonable conversations that can be had about the extent to which this is an issue. We took a different approach looking at it from a qualitative perspective. So the nature of service in these professions, the oath to the Constitution and to serving the American people. But thinking about how to frame this, do you see it as a widespread problem? Is it a small percentage of these populations? And how do we think about this as a unique challenge versus, lumped in with a variety of other adverse behaviors that we might see in law enforcement or the military?
Great. Thanks for the question, and also thank you for having me. Yeah, there was some trepidation on the Hill, and a concern that we're going to paint a broad brush of extremism pervasive in the military. But I think we need to remember that, the difference between this is a wholesale problem versus this is an issue, right? Those two things can be true at the same time, right? This is not a wholesale problem, but there is an issue, right? If you look at the last few months, you've got an arrest of a Marine officer in New Jersey planning to attack synagogues, allegedly planning to attack synagogues there. You had an individual in Fort Bragg drummed out of the military for support of white supremacy. You had another Marine in Hawaii who was planning a series of attacks there. So again, this is not to say that this is a overwhelming problem, but it is a concern. And I think we need to address the problem the same exact way. You do see a push and pull factor when it comes to domestic extremism. The pull factor is these groups, these militia groups, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the 3%ers, they're trying to pull in these recruits because it gives them a little bit of bona fides, right? A little bit of gravitas that they desperately need. And then you see a push factor too of individuals who leave the military and are looking for some sort of sense of belonging, right? They had that circle, that cocoon prior, and they don't have that now. And some of these groups try to fill that void when it comes to it. Now, if you look at domestic extremism, let's take January 6th as an example. Military officers and former military officers played an outsized role when it came to organized groups. So think of the Oath Keepers in their camouflage and radios doing stack formation up the steps of the Capitol. And these are guys that used their military training, their expertise, and tried to embed themselves in an organization in order to disrupt the election that day, the election counting that day. And so when you look at, say, the Proud Boys and things like that, former military officers do play a large role in those organized groups. But if you look at January 6th in general, the 900 plus people that have been arrested, I think we're at 921 as of this morning. It's generally on par. The percentage is generally on par with the general population of individuals who have a military background. But here's the thing, it's still 10%, right? It's still concerning nonetheless. And so when we think about this, the question then becomes, can we embed some programs, some prevention programs into existing systems in a way that addresses the issue, but doesn't make it the front end or be all of what we do when it is domestic extremism. We also have to remember that the reason why they're trying to recruit military members into these groups is because it shakes the core, right? They're trying to get to a point where it says, listen, if you're anti-government and you're a former military, you're not anti-government. You're actually true government, right? You're trying to affect change in such a way. And so the fact that they can recruit these former military officers into these groups plays a large role in the narrative they use to recruit others.
Yeah, I think you touch on something really important and vital that we found in the course of our research as well, which is this sense, these are professions that are not just a 9-to-5 job, they are an identity, and that transition out can be a vulnerable time when you're going from it being your entire identity to, even if you're transitioning to another career path in the civilian world, it might look more like a 9-to-5 job, and finding ways and resources to actually meet those needs, through for veterans. Certainly there's organizations like the Mission Continues that there's been research on, how that fulfills that niche and might reduce some of the vulnerability there. I'm also going to transition to the question of, one thing that we were mindful of is we weren't looking at, this wasn't an investigation of January 6th. This is of a broader trend. We've seen historically, there have been a number of examples of those tied to either the military, law enforcement, or in some instances, both, that were engaged in domestic terrorism. And so can you give us a sense of how much what we've seen in the last couple of years is continuity versus change?
I think a lot of this is continuity. I mean, look at the 1980s and early 90s when it comes to a rise of militia groups, culminating in the Oklahoma City bombing, with some military background there. And then a bit of a tamping down of the movement after the FBI and other law enforcement focused their resources on that in the late 90s, and largely untouched in the 2000s because focus was focused on international terrorism. What you've seen throughout the entire history of domestic extremism is the need and want to recruit former military officials and officers into the ranks because they provide some level, or at least they think it provides some level of training, right? So you don't have to train the individual on how to use a gun. They may have some background on explosives. And again, it gives them that gravitas. They desperately look. It gives them a level of legitimacy. They're desperately looking to grab on these type of things. And it feeds into a narrative that they're trying to advance.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much for that, Seamus. I'm going to turn to Rosa. So part of the reason why we're paying attention to this, even though the numbers are small, is that the participation of even a small number of members of the military, veteran, or law enforcement communities in domestic violent extremism stems from this sacred obligation that we as the American public tend to entrust to these professions. Your law enforcement experience and your subsequent book on your experience touch on how law enforcement officers view their roles and how they make sense of their monopoly on the state use of violence, which is what we as citizens entrust to the military and law enforcement. Could you speak a bit about what the profession demands of them as members of the profession, but also of society, and perhaps some of the personal sacrifices that come or that they're called to make in exchange for the power that we as a broader society share with them?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a great question, and I think it's probably useful to talk both about what the military and law enforcement have in common, but also some really significant ways in which they differ. They both involve being trained in the use of force on behalf of the state, although for the military it's primarily externally focused, whereas for law enforcement it's primarily internally focused. They both require sort of above average levels of commitment in terms of giving up your right to control your schedule, being willing to be part of a very rigid command hierarchy, et cetera. Not having the choice anymore to say, well, no, I don't feel like working at 4 a.m, or I don't feel like going to that dangerous place. So in those senses, they're very similar. And I certainly think that in terms of some of the skills that they gain, tactical skills, firearm skills, they're similar. But there are some really key differences, one of which, and I think this can't be overstated when it comes to thinking about countering extremism in law enforcement, is that the military is a hierarchy. It's got one leader. The President of the United States is commander-in-chief. He appoints the Secretary of Defense. Everybody reports through that single chain. So if you want to bring about change within the military, start a new program, have a new policy, there's a really robust system for disseminating knowledge and information and training through the entire ranks. Law enforcement is the polar opposite. We have about 18,000 different law enforcement agencies in the United States, and those range from the FBI, city police departments, rural sheriff's departments, campus police, you name it. And most of those police agencies, law enforcement agencies, don't really think they have to pay any attention to anybody else, right? That they respond. There's a sort of constitutional bare minimum baseline that applies to everyone. But aside from that, policing is extremely localized, which both means that there are enormous differences in culture and organization between police departments, that the Los Angeles police, the Chicago police, the Minneapolis police, the Washington, D.C. police are quite different in ways that are really hard to capture for people on the outside, I think. But it also means that if you want to change something in law enforcement, it's really hard, because there's no central, there's no chief of the chiefs. There are a few organizations that try to be best practices generating, but they have no particular authority. So that's a huge challenge. I think the other difference, and I don't know quite how this plays out. I do think that we have come as a nation to really venerate the military and probably place military personnel on too much of a pedestal, which makes it harder for the sort of healthy societal questioning to take place. But when it comes to police, I don't think that's true, right? I think that although police, as Seamus said, are very in demand in extremist groups because they are perceived to have expertise in the kinds of uses of violence, that the broader public doesn't necessarily see police as heroes anymore. Some do, but obviously we're coming through a period where, for some very good reasons, there's been a widespread critique of policing. I do wonder, in the case of police, whether that actually makes police a little bit more attracted to extremist groups. That, because another thing the military and police share is a sort of sense of, you don't understand us. Our lives are so different from the lives of ordinary people. They're so much more demanding, dangerous, et cetera. That it creates a feeling of specialness in a sense. And I think if you feel that way, but then you also feel like you're completely underappreciated, that you do look for things that will give you a sense of greater meaning, greater prestige, et cetera. I don't know if that fully answers your question, Kate, but that would be my quick response.
Yeah, and that leads well into my next question, which is that we do frequently hear, and we heard this over the course of our study, from law enforcement officers and leadership, that it's really challenging to impose any kind of policy or cultural change from the outside. And there's this deep feeling that those who are outside don't understand us. So do you see opportunities for internally driven countering violent extremism prevention efforts within law enforcement communities, and what might an effective approach actually look like?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I think that it's absolutely true both for the military and for law enforcement that if you come along and you have no experience in either and say, hey, you guys ought to do it this way, people are going to say, oh, you don't understand anything about this. And they're both cultures that are relatively opaque to outsiders and often fairly resistant to change imposed from the outside. Within policing, as I said, the added challenge is that it's so decentralized. But I do think, this goes back to some of the conversations that you had with Seamus and that Carrie had with Josh earlier. We don't know how big of a problem it is. We know it's an issue, but we don't know if it's a huge issue or a tiny issue. And there are some dangers in treating it as a huge issue, that paradoxically, in some ways, that might make it more appealing and attractive to people. This sort of big, bad, no, you don't, which can tempt people to go, well, maybe I do. But one of the approaches that I do think is promising, and it's an approach that's already being used with numerous law enforcement agencies, is a program that we in part have spearheaded out of Georgetown, which is the ABLE project, Active Bystandership for Law Enforcement. And it's essentially a program, train the trainer program, that focuses on peer interventions and training officers to engage in peer interventions. And it's not geared towards extremism. It's focused on a very wide range of things, ranging from police misconduct and abuse, excessive force, et cetera, but also to officer wellness, like how do you intervene if you see that your colleague has been drinking too much, or you're concerned about their mental health, which is obviously, again, for both military and law enforcement, rates of PTSD, depression, substance abuse are disproportionately high. And we train officers to think about how you respond to a peer, to a subordinate, to a superior in your chain of command. And we think that intervention is a skill like any other skill that can be taught and can be learned and can be practiced, and people can get better at it. And I think for extremism, that's also important, that the most effective intervention is frankly going to come from people inside the system and peers rather than from outsiders. And adding some training on focusing on, well, what are the worrying signs if you think a colleague is drifting towards violent extremism? That another officer is probably far more likely to notice that than the chief or somebody on the outside. They're likely to, they're privy to the locker room chat. They're more likely to be on private social media channels. So I think that's the most promising approach we have, is to really be saying to people, hey, loyalty to your colleagues doesn't mean that you say, okay, whatever you want is fine. Loyalty to your colleagues means that if it's like don't let friends drive drunk. Loyalty to your colleagues is if you see someone drifting in a direction that you think is really going to be destructive for them, destructive for other people, that loyalty means that you step in and you say, hey, what's going on? And that if you absolutely have to, after you try peer intervention, that you do go to the authorities. But that's the last step if you can avoid it.
Yeah, and you touch on the differences between the communities. One other major difference that we saw was just in the resourcing for post-service outreach and support. Obviously, within the military, there's the transition assistance program that walks people through what it looks like to transition back to being a civilian. There's the VA. There's a number of organizations, and that's not necessarily something that's available to the law enforcement community. So, are there any resources or effective outlets you think there could be for former law enforcement officers or those who are transitioning out of service, whether through retirement or just leaving the profession to go on to a professional career in something else? What resources do you think are out there, and who might be some good partners for that? I'm thinking of, the unions might be a good place to start.
Yeah, it's another really good question. I don't know the answer. I actually wonder whether Bishop, or I'm sorry, we've lost Josh Geltzer, may have a better sense of whether there are government resources that are flowing or are likely to flow in the future towards that. Because I think you're absolutely right that partly because as with the military, law enforcement can feel like such a sort of total experience. It's your whole life. For such a long time, then people leave and they feel really adrift. You go very abruptly from being an insider, a person with power, a person in whom trust has been placed, to just another person who's wandering around, and you don't get the feeling of specialness that you had anymore. And that's a moment when people are extremely vulnerable, I think, to recruitment by groups that say, hey, we think you're special and we want you to play a special role. Again, I think it would be wonderful to have more robust programs that assist people coming out of law enforcement programs. I'm not aware of any nationwide efforts to do that. And I think that at the moment, to the extent that any exist, they're highly localized. It's department by department, city by city. Police unions have played a really complicated role in all kinds of reform efforts. They have not always been drivers of positive change, but I do think that police fraternal organizations potentially on this issue could have a valuable role to play, precisely because you can depoliticize it and say this is not about a political agenda. This is just about helping officers transition out, find employment that's appropriate and satisfying to them, still feel like they have they're part of the family, rather than being sort of kicked out and isolated, which is part of what makes them more vulnerable.
Yeah, and we've heard that a lot too, framing it in terms of wellness efforts as opposed to some sort of behavioral modification.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Rosa. I'm going to shift now to Bishop. So Bishop, in your previous role in the Department of Defense, you were spearheading the process by which DoD updated its instruction and its policy guidance, and also some procedural issues with respect to countering domestic violent extremism. But I want to pose a question to you first about the changes to the policy itself. So I think in the interviews that we've had and in conversations even after the report has come out, there's a misconception that the DoD instruction targets ideology, or that it focuses specifically on anti-government sentiment or white nationalist sentiment, when in reality it spans a wide range of negative behaviors. So can you give an overview of how the policy changed over time, and also what the actual intent is of the policy?
Sure. First and foremost, thank you for having me. This is an incredibly esteemed panel, both with Rosa and Seamus, and before listening to Josh, who I've known for some time now, and just really appreciate everyone's overall thoughts. So the big thing is, it is, as I think Josh himself mentioned previously, we're talking about something that is ideologically agnostic. Meaning that we did not particularly look to any one or multiple versions of any type of ideology. What we actually did was, one, said, how do we remind individuals that we've all signed an oath and have a certain value set that we must uphold as members of this historic institution. And two, we look to the good order and discipline of units, and looking for another tool in the toolkit, so to speak, for frontline leaders and our strategic leaders up and down the echelons of chain of command to have in regards to addressing this type of negative, outright, dangerous, illegal behavior. Those were the two things that we really focused on in terms of drafting the updates to this policy. I know that you have many individuals who have worried that it was somehow politically driven, that there was some type of ideology, whether it dealt with your politics or your religious belief system, and that just wasn't the case. We looked at illegal behavior was in violation of both law and policy, and how we could go about best addressing it. And I believe you had a second part of that question too, about the process that we used, correct?
Yeah. So it was a pretty intense process. And I think what's interesting, having learned more about the process too, is the equities that you had at the table as you were procedurally going through these changes. You know, one of the questions that we got from the Hill frequently, and I think it's a fair question, right, is on the one hand, you have First Amendment, every service member has First Amendment rights to belief and association. And at the far end of the spectrum, these behaviors are already illegal. And so how do you think about that gray space in the middle where you can actually affect behavior ahead of time? So thinking about that, the process by which you thought about it and those equities that you had around the table as you were thinking about this, can you give us a sense of what that process looked like?
Sure. It was quite complex and detailed, actually. Originally, within the April 9th memorandum, we were told we would look at this for 90 days, and that almost immediately expanded to 8 months in total. A big part of which was because of the level of detail we wanted to have, not only in the actual development of the policy update, but in its oversight as well. Meaning we began, I know a lot of individuals, I know there have always been a lot of rumors that it was me behind a computer just typing away, making this update all by my lonesome. But how it was really done was we had a group of a little slightly under 100 individuals, both service members and civilians from across the department, from the services, from the joint staff, and from the fourth estate, helping us to develop this in multiple different smaller working groups. And that document, once we had the initial draft of it, went through a long and arduous process through the services, through both reviews at PNR, at INS, Intel and Security, and with the GC's office. Then it came back through the most senior leadership at the department, to include the chairman's office, our office with the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary. And then it went back to GC and over to the Department of Justice, where the Office of Legal Counsel, some of the country's most esteemed and intellectually rigorous attorneys in constitutional law, reviewed it before sending it back to us again for additional reviews, back to OGC, back to DOJ, and then to us for a final review. So this process was incredibly complex because, to your point, the different issues that we were really looking into when it came to protected constitutional rights. We had to find a balance between the First Amendment rights that everyone, even individuals who have signed up within our military, enjoy, along with the aforementioned good order, discipline, and cohesion of units. It's important for our leadership within the military to have the ability to do what is necessary to uphold that standard of unit cohesion. But at the same time, we don't look to infringe upon anyone's rights whenever we do that. And that is something that the Secretary was very vocal about. We know that these types of issues, as I think it was Seamus that and Rosa too, pointed to how we understand at least, or believe, that this is a very minuscule problem. That is a very small group of individuals who act on these type of behaviors, but they have a detrimental, outsized impact. Their actions can reverberate throughout, quite frankly, history if we're not careful. And it's very important for us to do everything we can to mitigate whatever small, however minute, 0.0005% of that risk, but at the same time ensuring that we balance the resources utilized. I'm not one to say, and to be clear, I did not have any type of separate budget in doing the years plus worth of work on this. I know that there have been rumors that questions about how many millions of dollars, particularly from the Hill. We got many questions about how many people and how much resources we were pushing towards this. I did not have a staff. This was me working at the behest and direction of the Secretary and the Deputy in the White House as best I could internally within the department, doing everything we could to find smart solutions with the people that were available and really eager to help us. At the end of the day, what we're ultimately doing was drafting a policy that supported and upheld rights as best as possible, while ensuring we could protect as many people as possible from the potential harm should anything go wrong.
So I'm going to leave you with the last question, which is, in your opinion, what is the most consequential change that you saw come through this policy process?
For me, it is the idea, I think, and I just hit it here, that we really vocalized at a very detailed legal and policy level how the department defines extremist behavior or violent extremist behavior particularly. And that we did so in order to do as much good as possible with as least harm as possible to those individual rights. And it is to protect service members, civilians, and military families, anyone that could be potentially impacted by this type of violent activity. And I say that because I know that there have been everyone from pundits to actual members of Congress who have very vocally questioned the need for these types of actions, and have questioned just the overall intent of why we would want to draft them and what type of behavior we were going about. And ultimately, it's because we understand that even though the vast majority of those who serve and do so admirably, some of them have in the past engaged in this type of behavior, and we wanted to do everything reasonable to mitigate it, so that we can protect life and ensure that those people that lift their hand and choose to serve have the ability to do so in a safe environment and meet mission success.
Well, thank you, Bishop, and thank you to Seamus and Rosa, and again to Carrie and Josh for our previous panel. We really appreciate everyone tuning in today on what we think is a really important issue of upholding the ideals of what we see in our military and in our law enforcement communities. Again, the report Protecting the Protectors released yesterday, you all can find on the CNAS website, and we look forward to future engagement on the topic. Thank you, everyone.